Okay, so welcome everybody. We are recording. This is our Lunch and Learn session on an introduction to Jewish prayer services. Happy to have you join today. I do want to say we can't learn all the things about Jewish prayer in 1 hour, but I hope that you will learn a lot and feel more comfortable with a Jewish prayer service by the end of our time together. You are welcome to put into the chat any questions that you have about Jewish prayer, and I will do my best to answer them. So I want to start out with just an introduction to what is Jewish prayer? Like when we say prayer, what do we mean? Because prayer itself, that word even in English, is different from the words services, liturgy, or worship. So I want to start with just defining terms. So when we think of services, a service, usually that's some sort of event of communal worship. So worship is usually thought of as a way to honor God, we'll say, or to be in relationship with God. You might even say to revere God. So there's definitely a God component of it. And when done communally, usually we refer to that as services. The word liturgy is an important word we're going to be using a lot today. Liturgy is the text that is used in the act of worship. And we are a tradition in which there is some fixed liturgy. That means there is set prayers that we use at certain times and in certain orders. Not every religious tradition is a liturgical tradition, meaning there are some religions where a service, a prayer service, the prayer leader can decide what prayers to do in what order. We have some of that ability to make decisions in Judaism, but we are a liturgical tradition. We have fixed liturgy that is done in a certain order, in a certain way. Welcome to everyone who has just joined. We're just getting started with defining terms. So back to the word prayer, when we talk about prayer, it can mean a lot of different things. But I want to note that prayer itself can be done communally or it can be done as an individual. Prayer can also be private or it can be done publicly. Prayer can be ritualized as a set ritual, a certain way of doing things, or it can be spontaneous. I would say Jews are a little less comfortable sometimes with spontaneous prayer, but it absolutely exists in Jewish tradition, and it is a way of praying as well. And as I said earlier, prayer can be with or without fixed liturgy, with the set prayers that we say in a certain order and in a certain way. So I want to kick off our hour together with the question, why might we pray in community with set liturgy? Like, what's the value in that? So that's a real question. If somebody wants to raise your hand, you can unmute and share, or if you want to put in the chat. But why do we pray in community with set liturgy? If we could just pray on our own, anytime, any words of our heart, you know, in our backyard, like, why would we pray communally with set liturgy? Any thoughts? Yes. I can't actually tell from your chat. Is that Lewis? Okay, great. If you can unmute yourself, because I can't hear you. Let's see. Beth said there seems to be an order to the prayers each tefillah, and that is true. We're gonna thank you for sending that message, Beth. We are going to talk about the order of prayers and how it is how it changes whether it's Shabbat or weekdays. So it's a great question. I will get to it. Lewis, yes.
To me, it's a way of being a part of a community, making community from joint praying and responding to the rabbi's questions, and it's all part of this building community.
Absolutely. So we could pray on our own at home and privately, but by doing it in community, it actually helps to build community. It helps us feel connected to community, but the act of actually doing it together is an important way of building community. Absolutely. Any other thoughts about why we pray in community with set liturgy? Creating a sense of unity between us and God. So meaning that us collectively have a relationship with God, I assume that you mean. We also could say it creates a unity or a connection between us and other Jews, that it's a way of us feeling connected to Jews around the world and also Jews throughout history. So I like to think about it as connecting Jews through time and space, that when we are saying prayers in a certain way, in a certain order, using our liturgy, just like our ancestors did, it connects us to the generations of Jews before us, and hopefully, God willing, the many generations of Jews after us, and to Jews all around the world. That even though there are variations from community to community and across denominations, there are, because of the way we have fixed liturgy, it does connect us to Jews everywhere. Okay, so we'll move forward. I want to give you just the very brief couple-minute history of Jewish prayer, Jewish worship, especially in this communal setting. And then we'll dive into the shape and structure of service, what the prayers are, why they're in the order that they're in, and how it changes over time. So in terms of history, going all the way back to the time of the Torah and the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, we see that Jews have been in conversation with God and have had some sort of communal worship of God. But the way that Jews expressed their relationship with God in a communal sense in the time of the Bible was through something called sacrifice. They would bring sacrifices to a central location, to a temple. So the Beit HaMikdash, the big temple that was in Jerusalem, is where people would go to bring their offerings. There are also other examples of altars that people built as a way to kind of offer up the sacrifice to God. Some of those sacrifices were animals. They sacrificed animals. Sometimes it was other things like grains and fruits. So they would bring their fruits to the temple as an offering to God. So there was this very kind of physical act of bringing something and giving it as a gift to God. That is essentially how Jews worshiped in a communal way, all the way until the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. That was in the year 70 CE, 70 of the Common Era. After the Second Temple was destroyed, Jews, in a way, had a real crisis. How are we going to be Jewish in a world in which we don't have a place to bring our offerings to God? We were a very temple-based tradition, temple in the temple, the idea of this place that you bring your sacrifices to God. So now when the temple was destroyed, what are we going to do? And so that led to the development of prayer as we know it today. There are examples of prayer before then, but the communal worship as we know it today really was a rabbinic invention, meaning the early rabbis, the rabbis of the 1st and 2nd century, tried to take the idea of sacrifice in this communal way and in this ritual way and shifted that into prayer, into a mode of worship that is through set prayers, through liturgy. So there was the development of the idea that Jews would pray a certain number of times per day as a reference to the times that Jews would bring sacrifices to the temple. So even to this day, traditionally, Jews pray 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and evening. And those are meant to correlate with some of the sacrifices that were brought to the temple. The sacrifices really were morning and afternoon. The evening, it was a little kind of controversial amongst the rabbis. Should we have an evening service? Should we have an Amidah in the evening? I won't say too much about it other than eventually it did get fixed as one of our daily prayers. So communally, Jewish prayer happens 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and evening. On Shabbat, there was, at the time of the temple, an extra sacrifice that was given called Musaf. And so in kind of traditional Orthodox communities, there is an extra part of a service called Musaf that gets added in as a reference to that time of the temple and the extra sacrifice. So just as it was the case back in the time of the temple, where there were these different sacrifices, where there were some differences depending on what day of the week it was, if it was a holiday, there were some ways in which the rituals changed. That is also true of prayer, that the way we have communal services changes depending on what time of day it is, what day of the week it is, and what day of the year. Like, is it a holiday? So what we're going to do now for the next 15 minutes or so is to look at the general structure of a Jewish prayer service. And then I will talk about what are some of the changes. So I'm going to start with, in a sense, one of the most full versions of a service. And then we'll say, well, these parts we take out on certain days of the week. But I'm going to start with more of the full service. So I'm going to share a document with you on my screen. And hopefully you can all see it. Okay, can you all see that now? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hold on, I am going to try to adjust my screen so that I can also see you all. Oopsies. So what you are looking at on the screen, oh man, I'm having trouble seeing you guys and the screen, but we'll do our best. What you are looking at is an overview of the shape or structure of a service, because a service is not just random prayers in a random order. It's very intentional, and it builds the same way that a plot builds in a story. So we teach this to sixth graders, and a lot of kids learn at school when they're learning about liturgy. They learn about how a story works. That when you have the beginning of the story, there's usually some kind of introduction. There's what we call the rising action. You get to some peak moments. At some point in the story, you get to a climax, right? The main kind of big thing that happens, or maybe there's some major battle or whatever it is. And then there is some sort of, the story moves to some sort of conclusion. So that structure of a story is what we do in prayer as well. We also, when we're teaching this to kids, we talk about it's kind of like a sports game or play that you go to. Any of those things works as a metaphor for what we do in prayer, because of this idea that we warm up. There are some events that happen, and the sort of the action builds, and then eventually it comes to a conclusion. So I'm going to share out loud the names of the different sections, but I will show you a different document in a little bit that gives more information. So you can see, I'm not sure if my pointer will work on this or not, but you can see at the beginning, there's a line that kind of goes up at the beginning. That is the warm-up section. That's where we're getting ourselves ready to pray. We might sing a warm-up song or two, but we're kind of getting ourselves ready to pray. Then you'll see the way that this is drawn, there's three kind of like plateaus. We did it that way just so you can write on this piece of paper, but in a way you can actually think of them as three peaks, like peaks of a mountain, P-E-A-K. So we have a little peak, we have a next bigger peak, and then we have the really big peak before we get to the conclusion. So that first little peak is the Shema. Many of you hopefully have heard of the Shema. It's an important part of our prayer service. We're going to talk more about that little peak, but that's the first peak moment of a service. So everything we're doing up to and including the Shema section is actually really not talking to God. What that is warming up, first of all, warming ourselves up spiritually, but also I like to think of this as the section of a service that's about God. And it's not all about God per se, but it's all about kind of our view of the world as Jews. It's who we are. It's kind of our theology. Where do we exist in the world? And I'll say a lot more about that a little later this hour when we look at those prayers. But that's the about God section. Then once we've done that, we get to the second peak. That second peak, or on this map, it looks like a plateau. That second piece is the Amidah. The Amidah is a standing prayer, and it's a prayer in which we actually are ready to talk to God. So everything we've done up to that point is getting ourselves ready to encounter God in relationship. We do that as individuals. We also do it as a community. So we stand up, we get ready to talk to God, and then we talk to God. That piece of the service is where that's kind of the biggest peak on a day that we don't read Torah. But when we read from the Torah, that is the biggest peak. That's that third peak on the chart, or here again, it's a plateau. But that third peak at the very top, that is the Torah service. That's when we take the Torah out of the ark. We read from the Torah. We interpret Torah. There might be a sermon or some sort of teaching. That's really the big peak moment. And that section is more about, we'll call it God talking to us. So, of course, we don't really believe that God talks to us in a literal sense, but the idea is that God talks to us through text, through our learning Torah. So if you think of the whole shape of the service, we have the whole section that's warming up and kind of about God. Then we have the part that is we're talking to God. Then we have God talks to us. That's the really big peak. And then we kind of come out of that with a conclusion. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. Oops. Okay. So it's nice to get to see all of you again. So in a moment, I'm going to share what those actual prayers are in a more specific way. But are there questions about that general structure, the idea that prayer is like this plot of there's a narrative, and that we're going from about God to God, God to us, and then we move to a conclusion? Any questions at this moment? Okay. If you have questions, you can also add them into the chat. So I want to shift now to what those prayers are. But before I do, I want to share what changes on a weekend or on a weekday or things like that. So what I showed you is kind of the fullest version of a Jewish prayer service. The Torah service, reading from the Torah, is something that Jews traditionally do 3 days a week. We do that on Shabbat, on Saturday mornings, and also Jews traditionally read Torah on Monday and Thursday mornings. That is because historically, back in ancient times, those were market days. Those were the days that people went to market. And so they were there. It's like, when is the community gathering? Let's read Torah when the community's gathering. Also, the rabbis teach that we don't want to go more than 3 days without reading Torah. So if we have Monday, Thursday, and Saturday, we never go too long without reading Torah. The Torah service traditionally is done in the morning. So in evening services, it's not as typical to read Torah. So if you're at a service that's not one of those mornings, then the structure's the same, but that third peak is just not there. Meaning you start with the Shema, then the Amidah, and then you move to conclusions. Now we get to the question of the Shema. So the Shema section is only done in the morning and the evening. And that's because it actually says, so the Shema is not just the one-liner of the Shema, but it's connected to Ve'ahavta. And in the prayer Ve'ahavta, it says, you shall recite these words when you lie down and when you rise up. Meaning, the way the rabbis interpreted that, we should say it in the morning and in the evening. So earlier I mentioned that there's 3 services a day, traditionally, morning, afternoon, and evening. And so we don't do that Shema section in an afternoon service. The afternoon service is called mincha. At a mincha service, there is no Shema section. So now you're like, but now there's only one thing left, which is the Amidah. We have the warm-up, the Amidah, and the conclusion. So hopefully what that shows you is that actually what defines a Jewish communal prayer service is the Amidah. That prayer, which is actually a collection of blessings, about 18 or 19 blessings, that prayer is a Jewish prayer service. If you do an Amidah, it is defined, now we have done a service. If you don't do any type of Amidah, it's not really officially a service. But the other things get added depending on the time of day. So the very shortest service is an afternoon service. It's basically just the Amidah with a little warm-up and a little conclusion. An evening service has the Shema section added on, Shema, Amidah, and warm-up and conclusion. The morning service, if it's a Torah reading day, adds in that whole Torah part. If it's not a Torah reading day, there is no Torah part. So that is the structure. I want to show you now another screen, which is of what are all these actual prayers that we're talking about. So let me load this for you. Okay, can everybody see this? I hope. Okay, great. So this is the oopsies. There we go. Now I can see the review. So what you're looking at now is in an ideal world, it would exist in that same structure as the other document. It's just that it was hard to write out all the things on one piece of paper, and this is designed to be printed. But this gives you a sense of what those prayers actually are. So you can see on the bottom right corner, you see that red box that says warm up. This box is in a morning service. These are the sections of the service. It's called Birkot HaShachar and Sukei Zimra. So these are the sections of the service that we warm up. And we're really just getting ourselves ready to pray in a whole bunch of different ways. In an afternoon or an evening service, this section is basically missing. We usually just start with one thing, like a psalm or an opening song or something like that. It's much shorter. But in the morning, it's kind of a longer warm-up, which makes sense because, you know, you're waking up and you're trying to kind of get yourself in the mood and ready to pray. So that's the first section. The next box we get to, sorry, I have to move my computer for a second, is the Shema section, the orange box, Shema uvirchotecha. I'm not going to say too much at the moment because we're about to do a whole bunch on the Shema section. But that is that first peak on the chart. Then the next peak is the Amidah, which is also called HaTefillah, the prayer. The word tefillah in Hebrew means prayer. And sometimes the Amidah, this prayer is actually just called tefillah. It's just the prayer. So that is that second peak. The third peak is this big giant green box at the top, the Torah service, which includes, reading from the Torah. It also can include reading from prophets, which we call Haftarah. And then we get our concluding prayers. The concluding prayers are pretty consistent across all services. Usually we sing a prayer called Aleinu, which is kind of about our obligation to make the world a better place, and our vision for a perfected world. Then we have the Mourner's Kaddish, a prayer in which we remember people who have died. And then there's often some sort of closing song or benediction or something like that. So that closing is pretty much the same at almost every service. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Okay. In a few minutes, I'm going to dive into that Shema section and go through prayer by prayer, what it's about and why it's all put together the way that it is. But I do want to pause. Are there any questions that have come up so far about the structure? So where does the Shema fall? So the Shema section of the service is the first major peak of the service in the morning and in the evening. I'll show you in a minute within that section, because it's a whole section. Within the Shema section, it's the peak of the section, meaning there's some things before it and some things after it. So we'll look at that in just a minute. But the Shema is toward the beginning of the service. Other questions about kind of the whole map? Okay, if other things come up, please feel free to put those questions in the chat. All right, so the Shema section. This is probably my favorite part of prayer to teach, so I'm excited to share it with you. Let me load it. Okay, can everybody see it? This is our Shema map. Great. So at the bottom of the page, you can see the three peaks that I was talking about and how the Shema section is the first peak. Then we have the Amidah section and then the Torah section. What I did on this piece of paper is I took that whole Shema peak and I blew it up and I made it bigger so you can see what is connected to this whole Shema section. So the first thing that you'll notice on the bottom left corner is that it says Baruch Hu. So probably many of you have heard the prayer Baruch Hu before. Baruch Hu is a prayer that in English, we say it's the call to worship. Meaning when we teach this with kids, we would say, how does a thing you're doing get started? A game, let's say you're at a sporting event. It's a football game. It's a soccer game. It's a baseball game, whatever it is. How do you know it started? And the answer varies depending on the sport, right? It might be kickoff, or it might be that a whistle is blown, or it might be that, like in basketball, I think they throw up the ball, right? So there's different ways that the game starts. But that's what the Baruch Hu is. The Baruch Hu is like the starting buzzer or starting bell, that we are starting officially our prayer service. So even though there's other prayers that sometimes happen before it, when you get to the Baruch Hu, you're like, okay, are we ready to pray? And essentially that's what the prayer is that the leader is calling out to the community, are you ready to pray? And the community responds, yes, we're ready to pray. Now, of course, that's not the literal translation of the prayer. The prayer itself is about praised are you God, but functionally, that's what the prayer is doing. It's saying we're ready to pray. This prayer traditionally is only done with a minyan. That means at least 10 people or more, because it is a communal experience. You have to be able to call out to the community, are you ready to pray? And they would say yes. So this is done in a group. This is very similar to in Muslim communities. This is something that is done with it's a call out from like a speaker. So you might have heard, if you're ever around a mosque or in an area with a lot of Muslims, where you'll hear the call to worship being done out loud from the mosque, like out of a speaker. And it's a very similar idea, which is like calling people to prayer, to say it's time to pray. So we have a very similar thing. It's just done in the context of the service, and we don't like project it out onto the streets or anything. So that's what the Baruch Hu is. Then what you can see here in this arc is that there are three prayers or three kind of blessings that surround the Shema itself. So the Shema itself is at the top of the peak. And the first blessing that kind of kicks off this section is a creation blessing. You can see here it says AM and PM because what the specific prayer is different if it's a morning service or an evening service, but they're all about creation. And that's intentional because remember, this whole section of the service is, we're calling it like about God. Even if it's not exactly about God, it's about how we as Jews view the world and kind of our place in it. So when we think about that, we start with creation, which is really just amazing that creation happened at all, meaning like the fact that the world exists is where we start. We start from that sense of wonder and awe and gratitude that there even is a world to begin with. So here, when we say creation, we don't even mean like the story of creation in the Torah. We mean just the fact of the existence of the world. So we say these prayers, these blessings, which are really noting light and darkness, the fact that we have both day and night, that night turns into day and day turns into night. Like that's actually pretty amazing. Sometimes with kids, I talk about like, what would happen if we only had nighttime or we only had daytime? We know actually that in a way, life would cease to exist. We need both light and dark, and many animals, the sort of cycle of time, it's really important that we have both light and dark. We need it for our crops, for food to grow. So just starting from that place of amazement of creation and also noticing the way in which creation is essentially renewed each day, that we look around the world. I'm looking out my window right now and, you see the trees and the light and the way that things are growing and changing each day. So that's what we start with. And in the morning, that prayer is called Yotzer Or. In the evening, that prayer is called Ma'ariv Aravim. But that is the purpose of that prayer, is about creation. The next blessing in this section of a service is about revelation. So again, the prayers themselves are different, whether it's morning or evening, Ahava Rabbah or Ahavat Olam, but the purpose is about the theme of revelation. Now, when we say the word revelation in English, sometimes I think that has a little bit of a Christian connotation. It is also a Jewish concept, but the idea is that when we think about kind of the world and God's place within it, we would say, well, the world was created, and at some point, God revealed God's self to humanity. This section is a direct response to Christianity. So if it's sounding a little bit Christian, the idea of revelation, it's because actually these prayers were developed at the same time as early Christianity, and it was a direct response because early Christianity was saying God revealed God's self to us as humans through the form of a person, right? A person named Jesus. And the rabbinic Jews of the time were like, no, that's not how we encounter God. That's not how we see God in relationship to us. That God reveals God's self to us, to humanity, through Torah, through text. So these prayers are actually all about Torah. And not just Torah, but you might have noticed in the names of the prayers, the word ahava. So ahava rabbah or ahavat olam. The word ahava is Hebrew for love. These are love prayers. And these are prayers about God's love for us as humans. And God loves us so much that God gave us God's greatest gift, the Torah. Now, again, that language might sound very Christian, especially when we say it in English, that God loves us and God loves us so much that God gave us God's greatest gift. Again, that's because this is a conversation between Judaism and Christianity. That Christianity would say God loves us so much that God gave us his only son, right? That's the language you might hear. This is the Jewish version of that, which is God loves us so much, God gave us Torah. And that's how we can meet God and connect with God and learn about what does it mean to be a human in the world today. So these prayers are about God's love for us, and out of God's great love for us, God gave us Torah. God revealed God's self to us through Torah. The other piece I want to mention about this section is that it's also about grace, about the idea of God's graciousness. Now, again, this has that Christian connotation that even if we don't deserve it, even if we mess up and we humans are fallible, God has this compassion and this grace for us that even when maybe we don't deserve it, God still loves us and God still gives us this gift of Torah. So those are the ideas of the prayers that are found here in Ahava Rabbah or Ahavat Olam. So far we've had creation, this idea that, wow, the world exists. That's amazing. Then we get to revelation, the idea that we can encounter God through text. Then we get to the Shema itself. The Shema itself is not really a prayer. It's not talking to God. It's essentially a declaration. It's a creedal statement. It's a way of saying, as Jews, this is who we are, and this is our communal belief. Now, granted, we might all have very different views of God and what God is and how we relate to God. I'm teaching a class on that in October for us to discuss what are different Jewish ways of thinking about God. But for today, for the purpose of learning about prayer, I'll say that the Shema is kind of a one-liner that says, we as Jews we believe in one God, and we call that God Adonai. That's sort of God's name. Yud He Vav He is our God. So this is meant to be just a declaration of what does it mean to be a Jew? To be a Jew is to believe in one God as opposed to lots of gods, and that there is this, this is the God that we are talking about, Yud He Vav He, or in English we would say Adonai. So that's the declaration of the Shema. It's then followed by traditionally by three paragraphs of text that all come from the Torah. The most famous is the first one, Ve'ahavta. It comes just straight out of the Torah. And Ve'ahavta, it says, you shall love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And then it goes on to say all these different ways that we can remember God and we can remember God's commandments. So it talks about putting these words on your doorpost, which we do with a mezuzah. It talks about teaching it to your children. It talks about reciting these words when you lie down, when you rise up, back to the whole reason we say the Shema twice a day, in the morning and the evening. So that's what Ve'ahavta is all about. So what I like to say is that the revelation prayers, and then we have the Shema, and then connected to the Shema, but kind of right after it are these other paragraphs that are also about love. They're about how we should love God. So I like to think of this little section as a love sandwich. That's the language I use when I teach kids in our community. This is the love sandwich. There's so much love. So what are the two, pieces of bread in our sandwich? We have the prayers that talk about how God loves us and God gave us Torah. The sort of meat or veggies, veggie sandwich. The middle part of the love sandwich is this declaration of we believe in one God. And the other part of the love sandwich is, and therefore we should love God, and we show God our love by reading Torah, by studying Torah, by living the things that we learn from Torah. So, out of love, God gave us Torah, and out of love, we live Torah. So that's the love sandwich that's part of the Shema section of a service. After we have that kind of peak moment of the Shema and the paragraphs that are connected to it, then we get to the blessing that follows the Shema, which here it's written Emet Ve'yatziv or Emet Ve'emunah. That's just the name of the part that begins these blessings, but it's much more well known by the words Mi Chamocha. This is Mi Chamocha. This is the prayer that we say after the Shema, and this is all about redemption. Again, redemption is one of those words that sometimes sounds a little bit Christian to our ears. It is absolutely also a Jewish concept, but the idea that the world, it needs to be redeemed, and that we actually believe that's possible. And the way that we believe it's possible that the world will be redeemed, that we will get to a time of redemption, is because of our story of the Exodus, because we look back and say, we were redeemed. We were redeemed from slavery. And so we sing Mi Chamocha, which is a prayer that the Israelites, it's not really a prayer, it's a song that the Israelites sang when they crossed the sea, when they were able to be free from slavery. In that moment of celebration and freedom, they sang this song. It's called we call it Mi Chamocha, but the song at the sea. And so we sing that song both to recall that story, to say we've been redeemed from slavery, we are free people, but also to then look forward, to say we believe in a world redeemed. We believe in a world where redemption is possible. And that not just that God redeems, but that actually we are partners with God in bringing about redemption. So it's kind of that reminder to ourselves of our role in bringing about redemption in the world. So when you think about this whole Shema section, there's a story that's being told. The story is that we go from creation, the world was created, it exists, it's here, to revelation, that we believe in a divine presence that is somehow part of our world, that we can encounter it through text, through Torah, through learning. And then we look to kind of the end of times, that someday the world will be redeemed. and that we are moving toward that. That is our vision of where we are headed in the world. So this is sort of telling our Jewish story all in one section of the service. None of this is really prayers to God in any way. This is all just kind of sharing that story of how we view the world. Then the one last piece, which is at the end on the right side of the page, in the evening, we add in a prayer here, Hashkivenu. Hashkivenu is more of the talk, a little bit talking to God. It's a prayer in which we ask God to protect us at night, because especially in ancient times, the night's scary. I mean, even to this day, the nighttime can be scary for many of us. Both because of the darkness and because of going to sleep. Both of those things can be scary. Sleep can be scary. First of all, sleep can be hard for many of us, but also, I hope I wake up, right? Like there was this sort of fear a little bit of going to sleep, but also especially in the ancient world where they didn't have electricity and they didn't have, lights in the way that we have, going to sleep meant it was a little bit scary from a safety perspective. You don't really know who might come or what might happen at nighttime. So, this prayer, Hashkivenu, was developed as a way of asking God to protect us, to shelter over us with a sense of peace and safety while we sleep, and to ask us, please help us wake up safely in the morning. So that is a little bit more of the talking to God, which makes sense because it's leading directly into the Amidah, which is where we actually do talk directly to God. So I would say it's a tacked on part of this section of the service, and it's only done at night. So if it's not nighttime, or evening, we don't do Hashkivenu. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I said a whole bunch of things. So questions. So question about why and when do we cover our eyes during prayer? Great question. So the custom developed, it's actually kind of a new custom, like in the modern era, that a custom developed to close our eyes for the Shema. For that, it means just like the one-liner of the Shema. So not this whole section, all these blessings, just the actual Shema. And I believe that custom developed as a way to help us concentrate, because the purpose of it is to remind ourselves of kind of who we are, our belief. We believe in one God, and it also declares God as one. And so there's this idea of oneness also, of feeling oneness with God, with Jewish people, etc. And so the idea developed that if we close our eyes, we can concentrate, we won't be distracted. It's also very short. You don't really have to look at the book to remember it. So that's where the custom developed, to close our eyes for the Shema. But again, it's a very new custom. This is not like a many thousands-year-old tradition. It's pretty new. And there are lots of places today that don't do that for the Shema. So it's just kind of a some people do it custom. Heather.
I feel really silly even asking this, but as you were saying that like Revelation was really in a reaction to Christianity, and I just never realized in the millions of Shabbat services how it's really the telling of a story. And I'm curious, like, do we know like what the oldest Jewish prayer is, like our first prayer? I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's actually really easy to answer. If you take the term prayer kind of loosely, meaning the way we think of prayer in the liturgy today developed over hundreds of years. So some of these prayers are very, very old. The Shema is in the Torah. I believe it's in the book of Deuteronomy. So it has existed for a long, long time, but being used as a prayer in liturgy is something that developed in the 1st century CE. But the oldest prayer that was used as a prayer is in the book of Numbers, and it's the priestly blessing. It's the Birkat Kohanim, which is found at the end of the Amidah. It's also done at life cycle events. We say it at baby namings. We say it at B'nai Mitzvah, at weddings. Parents bless their children with it on Friday nights. So, and often when I say that blessing, I will say, this is the oldest prayer we have in Jewish tradition. So it is the oldest, at least as used as a prayer with a fixed liturgy. Because we also have lots of examples in the Torah of people praying, but it's just their own spontaneous individual prayer. That's different than something kind of a fixed liturgy. So the earliest fixed liturgy is probably Birkat Kohanim, the priestly blessing. But again, some of these prayers, Mi Chamocha, Shema, Ve'ahavta, they're all in the Torah. So they've existed for a long time, but being used as prayer developed a little later. That makes sense. Other questions so far? Okay. I want to spend just a few minutes, maybe 5 minutes or so on the Amidah, and then we'll do a little bit more time for some Q&A and wrapping up. So the Amidah, I've mentioned a few times today. The Amidah is that second kind of peak of the narrative. But in a way, it's the major peak. When there's no Torah reading, that is the peak of a service. And it also doesn't really count as a Jewish service if you don't have an Amidah. So the Amidah is the heart of the thing. It is the prayer. And as I said, it's sometimes even called tefillah, the prayer. So the Amidah, which literally means standing prayer, has a few different names. In addition to Amidah, I said it's called tefillah, the prayer. It also is sometimes called Shmona Esrei. Shmona Esrei literally means 18, and that's because originally it had 18 blessings in it. It then eventually had 19 blessings. Some people took one out or combined two, so it went back to 18. So depending on where you are, which community you're in, it has either 18 or 19 blessings today. But people still sometimes use the terminology Shmona Esrei, which means 18. So the Amidah is an accordion, meaning what's in it varies depending on what day it is and what service you're at. So on a weekday service, weekdays means every day except Shabbat in Judaism. So Sunday is considered a weekday. So Sunday through Friday, any time of day, morning, afternoon, evening, the Amidah is that 18 or 19 blessings. That's sort of the full Amidah in a sense. When you get to Shabbat, it changes. And when you get to the holidays, it changes. So I'm going to start by sharing what's in those 18 or 19 blessings on a regular day, and then I'll say a few words about how it changes. The Amidah has 3 parts to it. And I like to share the parts with a little bit of a story. So remember, this is the part of the service where we're talking to God. And let's say you want to ask God for something, because that's one of the things we do when we talk to God. We ask for something, we ask for help, right? And the help might be, help bring healing, or help bring rain, or help give me wisdom, whatever it is, we're asking God for something. So the way I like to teach this, especially with kids, but I think it works for adults too, is that if you want to ask somebody for something, with kids, I say, let's say you want to ask your parents for something. How are you going to ask them, right? Like strategy wise, because you really want them to say yes. So this is the recommended strategy. You start by buttering them up. So you start with a lot of praise, right? You're like, I love you, Mom. You're so great. You're the best mom ever. So that's usually a good way to start if you want to ask for something, is to start with a lot of praise. So that is the first section of the Amidah. There are 3 blessings of praise, praising God for different things. Then you get to the asks, and that whole section of asks is quite long. So I think I'd have to do the math. Whatever 18 minus 6 is, that is 12. There are 12 or 13, again, depends on how you count, blessings of asking God for things in the middle. But then after you've made your ask, how should you end, right? What's the best strategy to end? With a lot of gratitude. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You're the best. I'm so grateful. Thank you, right? So that's how it ends. That's how the Amidah ends. So the Amidah ends with 3 blessings of gratitude. So it starts 3 blessings of praise, a whole bunch of asks, and which we call bakashot, requests. And then at the end are 3 blessings of gratitude. So that's the structure. And again, if you think of an accordion, you have 3 praise, 3 thanks, and a bunch of asks in the middle. That's the Amidah on a weekday, on a regular day of the week. When we get to Shabbat, Jewish tradition teaches that Shabbat is a day of rest, not only for us, but also for God. Even God gets a break on Shabbat. So the whole middle section, all those requests, poof, they're gone. We take them out. Those disappear. And in its place, we put a different blessing, which is basically a blessing about the day, about Shabbat. It's called Kedushat Hayom, a blessing that talks about the holiness of the day, in which we're saying, yay, it's Shabbat. We're so happy it's Shabbat. So on Shabbat, if you do the math, now we had 3 and 3, and we had 1 in the middle that's no longer an asking prayer. It's more of just about the holiness of the day. How many do we get? 7. So the Amidah has 7 blessings on Shabbat, which of course is symbolic. It's the 7th day of the week, the day of rest. So the Amidah looks different on Shabbat. When we get to holidays, it also changes. So when you get to Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, it changes. And actually a whole bunch of things get added into the Amidah. A lot of things get added into the Amidah. So when we think about why our High Holy Day service is so long, it's the same structure basically that we've been talking about, but the Amidah gets a lot longer. Sermons also usually get longer. The Torah reading is not that it's more aliyot, it's just that we might do more with the blessings and things. So certain things get a little bit longer on the high holidays. But the Amidah is sort of that accordion that gets shorter or longer depending on the day. The other thing to note about the Amidah is that, remember, this is where we're talking to God. And that's hard, or that's considered hard in Jewish tradition. Like, I don't know, how do I talk to God? What should I say? And is God actually listening? And it's like a super hard thing to do. And so before we even start the first blessing, there's I'll call it a prayer, but it's essentially a prayer to be able to pray. It says, God, please help me pray, because I'm about to talk to you and I'm not sure I'm so good at this. That prayer many of you might be familiar with. It's called Adonai Svatai Tiftach, or those are the words. Adonai Svatai Tiftach, Ufi Yagi Tehilatecha. Basically, it says, God, please open my mouth in words of prayer. It's saying, please help me to pray. So that's the intro to the Amidah. It's not considered the first blessing. It's like the hope that we can actually do this thing we're about to do. So that's the first part. The other thing that's important to say about the Amidah is that a lot of this is done communally. We would say some of these blessings together. But Jewish tradition teaches that in this moment, when we're talking to God, we should be talking to God as a community, but we also should be talking to God as individuals, because what I might want to say to God, me personally, is going to be different than what anyone else wants to say to God on this day. So we always, every single time have a time for personal prayer. Most of you probably know that as silent prayer. So we'll say, like, we're going to continue, we pray silently now. And the purpose of that is that each of us has a time to sort of say to God quietly in our minds, whatever we want to say. And so that's really important too, that even though we have fixed liturgy, we do these things in a structured way, that there is an opportunity for that individual spontaneous prayer, just whatever is in your heart. It's called tefillat halev, prayer of the heart. And that gets added in at the very end of the Amidah. Another thing to say about the Amidah is that in conservative and Orthodox communities, there is a repetition of the Amidah. It's done twice. In the Reform movement, there's a lot of ways in which prayers were changed. And one of them was to try to make the services a little shorter so that it's not so much of a burden on the community. And one of the decisions was to get rid of a repetition of the Amidah, to say once is enough. We don't need to do it twice. But if you're at a synagogue that's conservative or Orthodox, you will see that they do it twice. Okay, I'm going to pause. Questions there, either about the Amidah specifically or anything else that we've talked about so far. Terry.
Hi, thanks. You just answered my the repetition thing. Why some places, I guess it's within conservative. Well, anyway, some places people stand and different congregation they sit for the same thing. And
Yeah.
some stand and sit at the same place at the same thing. So how
So
did that
why?
happen?
Yeah, good question. Yeah. So an important concept to share as part of this this teaching is a phrase, minhag hamakom. I think I'll put it in the chat so that you can see what it looks like. Minhag hamakom. Which means the custom of the place. So in prayer, there are certain things that are what we'll call halachic, like Jewish law. And then there's a whole bunch of things that are minhag hamakom, meaning it's just the custom of the community. And the standing and sitting is a piece of this minhag hamakom, particularly with things that are not the Amidah. So the Amidah, the part where we're talking to God, at least at the beginning for the first part of it, is done standing up. It's in the name of the prayer. Amidah means standing. And the idea is if we're going to talk to God, we should stand up out of a sign of respect. So that is traditionally done standing. Although interestingly, in the early days of the Reform movement, they changed it to sitting because it was so long and it felt burdensome on people who had trouble standing for a long time. So they changed it to sitting for that reason. But that is really a standing prayer. Almost everything else, well, there are a couple of other exceptions, but there are many places in which there are different customs that develop. One of the biggest ones that you'll notice that varies a lot is the Shema. Shema can be done in any position. In fact, the rabbis teach if you're out on a horse on a journey and it's the time to say Shema, you can just say Shema on your horse. Or you could say Shema if you're up on, like, you're a worker up on a ledge. You can say Shema wherever you are, whatever position you're in with your body. You can say it sitting, standing, lying down. It doesn't matter. It's one of those prayers you can say however you are. The Reform movement in its early days, one of the changes that was made is to say we should be standing when we say the Shema, because it's a declaration. It's saying this is who we are as Jews. So it feels like declarative to stand. So the decision was made in the Reform movement that it should be a standing prayer. But again, there are many places that don't stand for the Shema. And I would say the actual official thing for the Shema is to actually say it in whatever position you were in previously. So if you were already sitting, you could stay seated. If you were already standing, you could stay standing. You don't actually have to change positions for Shema, which is very ironic because lots of people today do change their position for Shema. So Shema is lots of mixed practice in terms of Minhag HaMakom. Baruch Hu is done standing because it's a call to worship. So the leader is calling us to pray. We are responding, and there's a bow in it. And so that is done standing. The Aleinu is also traditionally done standing, and it is sometimes done in front of the open ark. And we always stand when we open the ark. So that's another prayer that is usually done standing. Most everything else is usually done sitting. Jason, to get to your question about bowing to the left and right, and I would also say just bowing in general. So there is a custom of bowing in the Baruch Hu as part of that call to worship. There is also a spot in Aleinu, one of the closing prayers, that specifically says we bend our knees and bow. Like that's in the words. So we bow at that point. In the Amidah, there is a custom of bowing in the first blessing, and in the first blessing at the beginning and end of that blessing are the spots that you would traditionally bow. Some people add in other bows, but that's like the kind of most important part. The part about bowing to the left and the right has to do with the idea of approaching God. So when we approach God for the Amidah, symbolically, some people take a few steps forward. But the problem is if you're sitting in pews or seats where there's a seat in front of you, there's nowhere to go. You can't step forward. So what people actually do is they take a couple little steps back so that there's room in front of them. Then they take a couple steps forward as a way of saying, okay, God, I'm like stepping into your presence. Then at the end of the Amidah, when you're done praying, you're done talking to God, you take a couple steps backward to kind of leave God's presence and bow. But the thing is, even though symbolically we're stepping into God's presence and away from God's presence, we know that God doesn't actually just exist in front of us. It's not like we believe in a God who's like standing in front of us, right? We can think of God as everywhere, all around, right? Wherever God is. And so that custom of bowing to the left and right is to acknowledge that God is not only directly in front of us. So people take a few steps backward and they bow to the left and to the right and to the center as a way of acknowledging kind of God's presence being not just unidirectional. There are some other places with some choreography. We don't have time today to go over that. But I will just say there are some other places where people go on their toes or people bow in certain directions or they turn and face a certain direction. So there is more to say. But the goal of today, of this hour, was to really give you a broad sense of what is the structure of a service, what are the different parts of a service, what are the themes of each of the major prayers. Why do we say them in the order that they're in? So that hopefully all of this feels more familiar. We have to wrap up in another 2-3 minutes. So I want to say a couple of other things. In terms of, Terry, you asked a question about next classes. So that's exactly where I wanted to go. These Lunch and Learn classes, this series is meant to be a series of introduction to a variety of Jewish topics. So today it was about prayer. Next month in October is going to be Cantor Korn leading a session on Jewish music. And specifically, the title of that is Why We Sing, What We Sing, When We Sing It, Music of the Jewish Calendar. So that will be about how Jewish music is related to the worship experience and also the calendar. And so each month will be a different topic with a different member of our clergy teaching. They're all being recorded, and we'll share them as well online on our website. But that is the purpose of these Lunch and Learns, is to learn a little bit about a lot of different Jewish topics, and to be able to do that online from home and in the middle of your day, whatever your day might include. So I hope this has been helpful. I will send to all of you who registered today, I will send out the visuals that I shared. I'm happy to send that along as well. So thank you all for being here. And we have, let's see, 1 or 2 more minutes if there's any last questions for today. Yes, Lewis? You have to unmute yourself.
Okay, sorry.
It's okay.
I always have trouble connecting the prayer book to the order of the service. I have to go. My doctor's calling me.
No problem.
Sorry.
It's okay. Thank you. So I will say about our prayer book, actually, there is one last thing I want to say, which is that the prayer book that we have, that we use at Temple Isaiah Mishkan Tefillah, actually on the side of each page, it has a little sidebar that actually does tell you where we are in the section. So if you're on the Amidah, it shows all the blessings of the Amidah, and it shows which prayer in the Amidah we're in. Or for the Shema section, it lists all the prayers in the Shema section, and it shows what prayer you're on. So it does try to give you a sense of where you are within each section of the service. The right-hand side of each page gives the traditional liturgy, and the left-hand side of the page gives some alternative poem or reading or something that's on the same theme. And then the bottom of the pages has some other information about where things come from. So that's how the prayer book works, generally speaking. Let's see. The last thing actually I want to say, back to the question about will we send reminder links about these Lunch and Learns, is that as you all know, you signed up through Sign Up Genius. So on Sign Up Genius, it will have the date of the next Lunch and Learn, and then you can sign up for it, and that's how you'll get the links and the reminders. It will get sent out. So thank you, everybody. It was great to be with you, and I'm going to stop recording.
Thank you.
Thank you.